this video, we're going to go over how to implement data validation in your programs. So there are many different types of data validation checks or error checking functions that we can implement into our programs, and they're all designed to catch different different user created errors. So we can have things such as a presence check, a range check, a length check, a type check, etc. But I'll explain those as we go. And I've just made a simple program here that takes free inputs from the user and then essentially checks them. So that's what we're working on today. So we need to obviously write our error checking functions here. So we'll begin with a presence check. So presence check is essentially it essentially makes it so a user has to input something into a field. They cannot leave it blank. So say for example, when you're registering an account, you obviously need a username and a password. So a presence check is there to ensure that you input at least something into the program there. So so you can't leave the field blank. So this is good for required fields which have to be filled in. So how I like to do a presence check is essentially assess how long the input is. So if len, which stands for length, so we're getting the length of the input, we're going to cast the input as a string here, and we're going to say if the length of the input is greater than 0, return true, else return false. Okay. Or I mean, you can omit the else there because you would have returned anyway. But I just like keeping it in for education purposes. Anyway, so we've got our length here. Okay. Now the reason why I have to cast this as a string is because we don't know what this input is, whether it's be numbers or letters. So we're going to need to cast it as a string, so the program treats it as a string. And then we're going to get the length of that string and see if it's greater than 0. Obviously, if the field's blank, the length will not be greater than 0. It will be 0. So we will return false, i.e. the user hasn't inputted anything, so it's failed the presence check. Otherwise, we'll return true because at least something has been inputted, and that's what the presence check does. So that's good. We've got our presence check. Now for these functions where I'm simply returning true or false, if you want to expand on them, maybe write a message saying, oh, you failed a presence check, by all means. But this is just for simple educational purposes. You can expand these however you like. We're just going to do the basics here. So the next thing, in fact, actually, we'll put in a message here. We'll do print. We'll do a message for all of them. We'll do print presence check for if you fail them. Presence check failed. Okay, so we'll just do a print statement there to tell us what's happened. And then we'll return false. Obviously, if you have a GUI, you would want to display this information to the user. But for our purposes, we'll just get output to the console. So the next sort of check we want to do is a range check. Now a range check ensures that that an input is between a numeric input is between two values. So it doesn't matter if the input is integer or a float, so long as it stays within the two values, it's fine. So this is great for an age field. So for example, if you don't want a person under the age of 10 signing up to your site, you can simply put in a range check to prevent anybody under the age of 10 from entering your site by just following this. Now, of course, the data validation does not stop user from lying about what they put down in the entry boxes. It's simply going to validate to see if it's a a valid input. But anyway, so we'll put our input here. Now we also need a high and a low value. So the value can't exceed this number, and it can't be less than this number. Ideally, sometimes people only put a low bracket or a high bracket. Ideally, you want both, just to make sure that your system can work on all edge cases. The low, so say if you only want people, you don't want anybody older than 80 registering for your site. Well, you still want to put a low value for something like 0, just to make sure that you're not getting invalid negative numbers and things. So anyway, we'll do if. Now, remember that we don't know what this input is going to be. Now, what if this was a string? So this is why we need to cast this as an integer. And in fact, hold on, this should really actually be a float. Sorry, my mistake. So if somebody puts in a decimal, well, it depends. For age, actually, we'll put in int, because it should be a whole number. If you were doing something like prices, you would do float there instead. But we'll do this, and then we'll say is greater than the low value, and high is greater than or equal to the input. Then we'll return true. Else we'll say print range check failed, and then we'll do our plus string input. Okay, so just to show what the input is. So we're having this AND statement here, making sure that both these conditions are true. So this won't work if we get a string, because we can't cast the input as a string. So that's why we're going to, whenever we're going to call these functions, we're going to do it. We need to make sure we do it correctly. So we're returning true. Oh, I forgot the return false there. Okay, so this conditional line here with two conditions, making sure the input's bigger than the low value but smaller or equal to the high value, or make sure that the input stays within the range specified. So that's a range check. We'll go on now to a length check. Now, a length check is kind of like a range check for strings, but it's instead of a numeric value, we're going to be looking at we're still going to be looking at a numeric value, but it's the length of the string rather than the numeric value of it. So we'll define that function, and then we'll say if the length. Now remember, len and then the input. So len returns the length of the input given, length of the string input given. So we'll say if len input greater than or equal to, and then desired size, because that's the desired length, return true. Oh, sorry, caps lock there. Return true. Else print range check failed. Oh, sorry, not range check, length check. My mistake. Length check failed. And then we'll do semicolon space, and then a plus input there. We need to cast that as a string. So what's this doing? So we're getting the length of the input, and we're just seeing if it's if it's if it is a larger, no, we need to swap these about. Sorry. We want to make sure that the length does not well. You see, it's the same as the range check. You can set you can interpret this in different ways. You can have it so that there's a minimum and a maximum length for your strings. Right now we have a minimum desired length. So greater than or larger than. So the input needs to be greater than or equal to the desired size. Now, if we were to, so if we say desired low size and put that there, and then desired high size, okay, it's very similar to the range check, but instead of analyzing the numeric input, we're instead sorry, hold on, high score I've written, sorry, we're instead analyzing the length of the string. So yeah, and again, this is the difference. This is a greater the crocodile eats the bigger number, so we're saying that that is larger than the input, but this here we're saying that the input is smaller than or equal to the desired size. So there we go. So again, this is like a range check only for strings, but instead of a numeric value, we're looking at the length of the string instead. And then we'll say else, and then we'll do return false. Sorry if that was a little confusing, but you can see here that they're very similar. Okay, so now we'll go on to lookup checks. Now, lookup checks, people have some difficulty comprehending what a lookup check is. So a lookup check is it's useful. So a lookup check essentially asserts that an input can only be one of these things, and in a list of these things. So, say for example, gender, you can, well, for sex, you can only be male or female. So, the lookup check will be either you can look at the lookup check enforces that you can only choose male or female, or only input male or female. Say for example, US states, there's a finite amount of US states, so if your input doesn't match one of those, it'll be an error. So lookup checks are great when there's only a finite amount of inputs. Something which doesn't have a finite amount of inputs is, for example, a name. A name doesn't have a finite amount of inputs because you can have any string of characters, and that would qualify as a name. So, but for example, for countries or US states or things like that, which are fixed and finite, a lookup check is used. So we need a lookup check. For lookup check, we need the input and we need a list of options, the list of states, the list of genders, things like that. So we'll do that, and then we'll say if input, now this is quite Pythonic here, if input in options, and what that keyword in is doing is it's checking if the input is within the list, if there's an occurrence of the input in the list. If there is, then that returns true, and we say return true because your input is in the list of options, so we know it's valid. Else, we're gonna say print look up check field, look up check field, and then we'll just give out the input there. And of course, the plus str input, we're just saying we're concatenating the input here to this output. statement here, and we're just casting it as a string to make sure it's printed. So there's that there. And then we obviously need to return false at the end. Okay. And again, remember, you can expand these. They don't necessarily need to be print statements. Now, the next one we want to do is the type check. So the type check is going to determine what data type the input is. And we need to, so it's going to discern this, hold on, and then, so it's going to discern this, it's going to tell the difference between numbers and letters, or integers and strings, you know, things like that. So it's quite important because a lot of these other functions require on the knowledge that the input is of a certain data type. For example, the range check won't work on strings. You need to call the type check before you call the range check to make sure that that's not going to break, because you can't cast a string as an int. So anyway, that's quite important. So we'll do our input here. Now we also need to take in the data type. Now again, there's many ways you can write type checks, but I'm just going to have a input here that's just saying what we think what we want the data type to be. So if data type equals and then equals str. So we'll pass in the name of the data type. So if it equals a string, we'll do if input dot. Now Python's great because it has a whole load of inbuilt map functions. So for example, input dot is alpha. We'll check to see if your string contains only alpha characters or alphabetical characters, A to Z. And then that will return either true or false, and if it returns true, we're going to just return true. Else, return false. And we also need to print our thing saying type check failed. Type check failed. And then we'll do our traditional str input there, just output what we've done. And then if we say, oh, we want this to be a we expect this to be a integer, so we'll pass in int there. We'll say if input dot is numeric instead of is alpha, because this will check if it's if the string is a number or not. So if input dot is numeric, return true. Else print type check. In fact, we can just copy this, can't we? We'll just copy this. We'll do this. Oh, we'll do this, and then we'll return false. Okay, so there we go. And in fact, that str is yeah. So we're casting the input as a string, just make sure we're outputting. So you can see here that we're going to put in our input, and we're going to put in what we think it's going to be, a string. So when we say the data type should be a string, we're going to call input dot is alpha. But if we say the input should be an integer, we're going to call is numeric instead. All right. So we're going to do that now. We're going to need to do our last sort of data validation function, which is called a format check. So let's do that now. We'll do a format check. Now, the format check, I remember at the start I said that you can do these multiple different ways. The format check you will need to change based on the format that you expect. I'll explain. So I'll explain what format check is. So a format check ensures that an input conforms to a set of rules. Custom made rules made by the programmer. So for example, a postcode input would need to have a certain number of letters and numbers in its input. An address would need to be formatted correctly with spaces between the house number and the street name, things like that. So we're talking about a format specified by the programmer that is implemented via this function. So format check. So we're going to pass in our input, and we're also going now. This one is very simple. This is going to this will check that a character is in a string. It's like the most simple format check. This would be useful for emails. A lot of sites will say that your email is invalid because it doesn't contain an @ symbol. So this is what is used to do that sort of check. So we say if must contain in input, and there's that keyword in again, very important, return true, else print format check field plus str input. So what is this in doing? Now remember, we used in here for this lookup check, and remember I said that the input needs to be of or be in a list of options, a subset of options. Well, in this case, we've sort of reversed it, where we're saying that the character we've specified must be in the list of characters in the input. Remember, a string is a list of characters, essentially. So when we use this in, where we've got a character here and an input here, where saying essentially is the character in the string in its most basic terms, and I've never used the word in there. You can also use this thing called substring, but which is another one of these built-in one of these, but will not built-in methods, but we'll not worry ourselves with that because this works just as well. So yeah, you can also check for substrings using this, but this is good for us here. Simple and neat, and we also need to obviously put in our return false there. Brilliant. Okay, so we're returning false there. So these are our error checking functions or data validation functions, and yeah, there are more, but these are like the core validation functions. Things like a uniqueness check, where the input needs to be 100% unique, i.e. it's not been inputted before. That's useful when making usernames, but I'm not going to do that here because that requires a database or a text file, and I'm not going to set that up now, but just know that it's out there, and there's many other different ones. So we've got all these functions now, but if we run the program, nothing happens. It doesn't matter what I type in here, because the functions aren't being called. So we need to fix this here. We need to fix this. So we're going to write some more functions. Now this is how I'm doing it. Now you can do it however you like, but the great thing about how we've written these functions is that they're generic, which means that we can use these functions multiple times for different situations. We'll always need to do a presence check. We'll always need to do a range check, and we just need to write the code once. We don't need to repeat it again and again. So anyway, so we're gonna do name validation, and then we'll also do our age and our gender validation functions here. So the user's gonna input a name. Now the way so we'll do that. So we'll say define name. Yeah, okay. So here we go. If presence check and then we have to pass in our input, which is name. Remember that that we're passing in the name here. That's going to be the user's input. So if presence check name and length check name, and then we need to think. Now we've got the desired low size and desired high size. So what would be a good low and a good high? Let's say that you can't have a name lower than 2 characters, and you can have a name. You can't have a name higher than 20 characters in length. Let's just go for that. And type check. Okay. Name str. So we'll put in a string there. Okay. And in fact, there's an issue here. Well, first we'll need to think what we're doing here. So we need obviously to make sure that the name's inputted, and we need to make sure that the length is of a certain the input is of a certain size. Now, if we go back, we can see that the length check needs a string. Otherwise, you can't call len on it. Len will only work with strings, so well, should only work with string. So that's why we need to make sure that we've got a string in here. So how are we going to just make sure that we've got a string? Well, we use a type check. So instead of having it on this and statement, we're going to delete that, and we're going to say if type check name and then str and in fact we can move this presence check up there as well, and type check string. Then we can say length check if length check, and then we'll just say print valid name, and then that's it. Oh no, actually, before we say that's it, we need to obviously make sure that the user knows that they've made a mistake. So I'll come back to that. So what have I done here? Well, this and is important because remember we're returning true or false. So remember the presence check returns true if there is a input, essentially, if the input has a length greater than 0. So that will return true, and then this will return true if it's a string. So important. It's important to think of the and operator here. Now, and will return true if both of these things are true. If one is false, then and will return false. Remember back to circuit diagrams and logic. That's the rules essentially. So that's why we use our and operator. If we put or here, then it would mean that if we put in numbers, something's been inputted, so that will be true or 1, and then but this would be return 0 because it's an integer instead of a string, so we'll return 0. 1 or 0, well, 1 is 1. There's at least a 1 there, so that means or true there. So we'll go on to the next bit, i.e. this returns true. But that's wrong because we don't want integers, we want strings. So that's why we're going to need to change that back to an and. Now length check, yep. Between 2 and 20 is fine. We'll print valid name because that will return true. We'll return valid name. If it doesn't return true, then we need to tell the user that you've messed up. So what I like to do, instead of doing lots of pop-ups, I like to just configure we'll go to the entry box that the user has made a mistake in. So in this case, it will be name entry because we're doing the name validation, and we're just going to say name entry.configure background equals red. Okay. And then same for this else statement here. Name entry dot configure background equals red. So this will turn the entry box red, which is a good indication to the user. And in fact, that technique's used on lots of different websites and things. But don't think of this as an absolute. Remember, be creative. You can send messages to the user, things like that. So anyway, yeah, that's the name validation. I'll now do the age one. So define age validation, and we'll take in the age here. Okay. Now, if presence check age and type check age int, because remember it's an age. If range check age. Now we want to set a high and a low. So I'm going to say, let's say 120 is the highest age, and the low, I don't know, let's say 10. So you can't go lower than 10. Then we'll say print valid age, and then else age entry dot configure background equals red, else age entry dot configure background equals red. Right. So that's the same structure as the length check. So I mean the name validation. So I won't bore you with how we do that or what the logic is there. We'll go on now to our last one, which is the gender validation. So what do you say? Define gender validation. Gender. Okay. Now, if presence check gender and type check is gender, comma, string, and lookup check gender, comma, male, comma, female. Okay, so I'll explain this line here now. So, okay, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Sorry, why is this red squiggle? Oh, because we're not missing a semicolon. Right, so, what we're doing here, so this is the gender. So we're saying if the user inputs a gender and the gender inputted is of type string and is in the input is in this list, then true. Okay, then continue. So we really don't actually need either of these two validation functions, because the lookup check will catch them all the errors anyway, because the lookup check's quite restrictive. It will only allow male, the string male with a capital M, or the string female with a capital F. It won't allow anything else, because that's what we've designed it for. This list is the list of options given. Where is it? This is the list of options. So the input must be in it in the list of options. So in fact, we can actually just delete this line here, these functions here, and it will all work the same. I'm just going to keep them in though. Well, no, actually, I'll just leave them out. We'll just leave them out. But so that's kind of like, so you don't need these two functions. I'm just illustrating why we don't actually need them. Because the this will return false if the user doesn't input anything, or if the user inputs numbers. So we'll delete that then. Delete these then. Okay, let's do that. Let's delete that. Okay, cool. Right. Okay, cool. So, let's think now. So if lookup check print valid gender, else gender entry dot configure background equals red. Okay, so there we go. That's our validation functions done, these are the specific validation functions, which call the generic ones. But now there's an issue because we're not actually calling these functions. So we now need to go into our tkinter here, into our tkinter commands here, and trigger them. So I like the idea of whenever the user inputs something and then moves away from the entry box, it will the program will tell the user that, oh, you've messed up, or there's an error. So we'll go here and we'll say so after the name entry box, we're going to bind the function to a key command or a keystroke. Keybind, and there's a video on the channel about keybinds if you're interested in that, but in more depth. But we'll do a name entry dot bind. Okay, so we're doing a dot bind, and we're doing a focus out. So whenever the user tabs out of the entry box, there's going to be this function call. Now, since we don't want to trigger, since we're passing in since we're calling a function, we need to that has input that takes in parameters. We need to use lambda, so we need to use lambda underscore colon name validation. Now I know that's not the only reason why we need to use lambda, but this is, I'm just explaining just for educational purposes. Name validation, name input. Okay, so this is our tkinter variable, and we're doing a dot get here. Now the tkinter variable here has been defined up here, and that's going to be the user's input there. So yeah, so where are we? Yeah, name dot get. Okay, cool. So that's the bind done. Now, since we're calling this is sort of treated as an event, so we need to actually go back to our validation function, and we need to just say that event equals none, because whenever you do a keystroke event, it will pass in this event object, but we just want to ignore it. Now, I'm just going to copy this and put it in all of these ones just to make sure, because it's the same trigger that we're going to use, so I don't want to have to go back and then repeat myself. Yeah, so that's fine, and then we'll just do the same. We'll do age entry, but instead of doing name validation, we'll do age validation, and again age input. Now look at that. Now I only have to change one sort of word there. That's good variable name design. We only have to change one aspect of the variable name instead of the whole variable. So we'll do gender entry here, gender validation, and gender input. Okay, so we now should be ready to go. So whenever we run this, getting this program here, so I've clicked into the to the name. Now let's see if our let me bring the console up, because remember, oh yeah, so we'll reset there. So let's say I don't put anything for the name and just tab into the next or select the next entry box. We get an error and the box turns red saying the presence check has failed. So we'll reset that and go back. And again, this works whenever you click as well, so just letting you know. So name. Okay, so name. Is Barry a valid name? Yes, it is. Okay. Let's see if a list of string of numbers is valid. No, the type check fails because that is an integer and not a string. So we're going to get a type check fail there. And it's good that we get the output of what actually was inputted there to show you. Name is T. Now remember, that's going to validate our length check. Tab, length check failed T, because that's not longer than 2 characters. So, and then if we do a reset and then type in a whole load of characters, I think what we set was the high was 20. So whenever we tab, there we go. Length check failed. Okay. So, we now move on to our age, and our age seems to be working well with our presence check. Okay. Yep, the presence check works. Now, if we do 45, that should be valid. Yep, valid age. What if we put -9? Oh, type check failed. Yeah, so the type check failed. Reason being that where are we? Age validation, no, yes. So the type check fails because the -9 is being treated as a string rather than an integer, because it's being read in as a string. For that, I know that the range check didn't trigger, but the type check prevented it. If you want a more granular, this sort of structure it's not great at telling you precisely what has gone wrong. If you wanted a more granular, more structured one with a message explaining what went wrong where, I would do more if statements. Instead of just having these ands, I would do if, and then a whole chain of if statements, or a case statement. We can't do case statements in Python, but that's what I would do. But for this, it's fine. -9. It didn't get through, is what I'm trying to communicate. And then if we type in a whole word, no, the type check failed. And then if we say 0, no, the range check fails, because although it's a number, an integer, it's not bigger than 10. So if we do 5, yeah, we can't do that. Things like that. Okay, cool. So now we go on to gender, and gender only has a lookup check. So whenever we click into it, we'll say, let's do this. Does that let me know? Lookup check failed. Let's say if I type in the word male, but no, and then I'll do. Yep, that's invalid. Why is that invalid? Why is male invalid? Well, if we go back to our list, yes, you can see the if lookup check. See this list? See the way we've got capital M male and capital F female? That means that we need that list. That is totally different to male. So if we had that there, that list like that, then that input would have gone through. But since we didn't, that's why the error came up. So what if we type in female correctly? Yep, valid gender. So you can see that this is now error checked. Alright. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is some Tkinter widgets that can actually help you with validation. So, or have built-in validation in them. So let me comment out these lines here and uncomment out the spin box, and uncomment out these 2 lines, and then comment out these 3 lines here. So I'm putting in a spin box for the age and an option menu widget for the gender. So when we run this, now we've got something different. Name's still exactly the same, but now we have age. Now age can only be between 1 and 10. I've set it here from 1 to 10. But the spin box is enforcing a range check here, because I can't. Well, I could type in 89, but if I try then to update it, it's not going to work. I would still put in validation for, even if I'm using a spin box, I would still put in validation, because if you put 89 here, and then don't touch these buttons, it's not going to change back. So I would, if you are going to use a spin box for validation, I would have it, but also have a range check in there just to make sure. But that's enforcing a range check. You know, allowing a user only to select a certain number there. Now here's the lookup check, only illustrated in an option menu, so you can only select male or female, and that is force the user to choose these two, the either option. You know, a list of states would be like presented to the users like this. You know, where the user can only, since there's only a finite amount of inputs, the user should only be inputting the finite amount. They shouldn't be creating their own, essentially, which is a more elegant way of doing it instead of having to write a lookup check. But there you are. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.